Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I want to share an observation that I've made over the last few months. A lot of times, I will notice something in a phrase, in a sermon, or a book, or the appearance of something will just give me pause, and I'll say, that's interesting. What does that signify? Often it doesn't signify anything, but I accumulate these little nuggets in my brain, and occasionally patterns start to emerge. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. What is that telling us? And so today I want to share an early stage observation on the way that evangelical leaders talk about violence. I don't know if you've noticed this, and one of the reasons that I'm telling you about it is because I would maybe like to get some feedback from you on what you're seeing. Examples. You can help me collect more information to see if I'm on track or off track. So I'm not going to claim this is a comprehensive survey of the literature. What I am going to say is this is something that I started noticing within the last few months this year. It may have been going on earlier. But before I do that, I had a family member who suffered an accident over the summer, and he's now in rehab. It was a very serious accident, and now he's really on the mend and really doing well. So I got to see him, and it was great to see that. And it took me back to early in his recovery from this accident when it wasn't clear what the ultimate outcome was going to be. And somebody in his network sent out a note via a Facebook group to a group called the Lagodi Prayer Warriors. Now, Lagodi is a small working class town in southern Indiana. And that's kind of my environment where that came from. And apparently, they've got 100 people in this Facebook group that just pray whenever blasts go out for someone that needs prayer. And so it's pretty amazing that when you have someone in need, that you could very quickly activate a network of 100 people who are going to pray for you. And even if all of them don't actually pray for you, even if a quarter of them pray for you, having 25 people pray for you is amazing. And I wanted to highlight that because it shows some of the amazing things that come out of these much maligned rural areas that you get so much hate from a lot of people today. Yes, these places are economically depressed, they have health issues, they have a lot of problems, but there's a lot of great things in these communities. And so I just wanted to say that's one of the great examples that this is still where networks of faith are really strong, really powerful, and people really do get involved in praying for the lives of their neighbors and family members of people who are somehow associated with them. So that is great there. There's been a lot of talk recently, probably in the last several years, about justice. And you often hear it said that God's justice is different from secular definitions of justice. So I've seen entire sermon series preached on justice. And one of the things that I have never come across, however, is a crisp definition of God's definition of justice. What is God's justice? How would we define justice from a biblical or a God perspective? I actually couldn't articulate one myself, to be quite honest, if you ask me, and I haven't seen one. So if you know anyone who has a great definition of justice from a biblical perspective, I would love to get it. So please email it to me. But I noticed the way that people talk about justice, and justice today seems to be spoken of in terms that are almost entirely related to some form of social justice, like economic inequality or racial inequality or something of that nature. And I would suggest that that is an important dimension of justice. Certainly in the Old Testament, my reading is that if you look at what the prophets are primarily concerned about, number one is idolatry. Number two is some form of, justice within the nation of Israel. Now, again, Israel was God's, covenant nation, and they operated under a sort of theocracy, which we don't today. In the New Testament era, the church is sort of the new Israel. So, what does it mean to have justice? Is it more about unity in the church? Yeah, I think there's a lot of things we can say that maybe some of the things that they talk about in the Old Testament are not directly applicable to the church era because they were specific to the nation of Israel, which lived under a very detailed set of God's laws. Nevertheless, I would think that's a valid component of justice, injustice, between people, in the societies where we live. That's part of it. I don't know the last time I heard anyone talk about justice as talking about the justice due to sinners from God, the justice that that they merit on account of that. We don't talk a lot about that today. Sort of sin seems to be off in its own separate category. And then another thing that really gets me is you don't hear a lot about justice due to victims of crime. Like, wouldn't crime victims, people who've been victims of violent crime, people who've been victims of theft, wouldn't these be people who have a claim to justice? This is not something that I hear talked about a lot. If you're going to hear a sermon or a topic on justice today, justice seems to more emphasize the social dimensions of justice rather than sort of the criminal or kind of penal dimensions of justice, maybe more economic justice, versus criminal justice. And that's just thematically, that is what I see. And I've heard entire sermons preached on God's justice that never once spoke about the justice due to the victims of crime, those who've been victims of violent crime, for example. Which brings me to violence. And I noticed this a few months ago. The way that people in churches now speak about violence. And there's two things that I notice. One is that violence is often presented as if it were a separate category from justice. Secondly, is that the way people talk about violence sort of presents it rhetorically as if it were a natural force, like an earthquake or a hurricane. It's something that just happens, that has tragic effects, but it doesn't seem to directly be imputed to human agency, which of course is what violence is. So I noticed this one time when someone was giving a prayer in church, and they said, something like, Lord, we just pray, that you will protect victims of injustice, of violence. And that's interesting. Violence was listed as something distinct from injustice. And so I started paying attention to that. And I realized that this is often a way that I've noticed people talking about it, that violence is a separate thing. There's injustice over here, which again has often a social justice, a racial justice, or economic justice angle to it. Violence is just off in a different category. As I noted, when I'm hearing these sermons on justice, criminal justice, justice for crime doesn't seem to play a big role, and at least not in what I've heard. Again, I haven't gone and done a comprehensive survey of sermons or read a ton of books on that, and I don't really want to, but this is something I noticed. And so I would love to hear from you if you are noticing the same thing. Pay attention to the way pastors talk about the word violence. And is violence spoken of as something that is included under injustice, or is violence talked about as if it's something that's separate from injustice? It's not 100% the way that I described it as a separate thing. I was really geared up for this podcast today, and then yesterday I heard a corporate confession in a service that actually did include violence as under the heading of injustice. So I'm like, wow, that's what I would expect. That violence at some level typically involves some kind of injustice in our world, probably does. And so, yes, you would think if you're talking about injustice, then violence would be a subheading under that. And so this confession actually did. It talked about inequality, and then it talked about violence as essentially subheadings of injustice. I'm like, wow, that's what I would expect. But I'm noticing it the other way, where justice and violence, injustice and violence are seen to be essentially two separate concepts. And just the very term of violence, I don't remember people talking about violence when I was a kid to the extent that they do now. It seems that people love to talk about violence as a category. And just the naked word violence almost makes it seem, again, as if it is some sort of a force of nature. It is some sort of a natural phenomenon that just happens and rolls through society and bad things happen. It's not something that comes out of human agency, human evil, etc. And so just before I got on this podcast, I said, I wonder if people talk about George Floyd as a victim of violence. So I just did a quick Google. I just Googled George Floyd victim of violence. Interestingly, that phrase does not autocomplete on Google search for me. Even when I started typing, VIOL, it did not autocomplete. I had to type the entire phrase. And there are people that talk about it. But when they're talking about George Floyd's death, there's always a qualifier on the word violence. He's not described simply as a victim of violence. He's described as a victim of police violence. There's a human agency applied to it, or there's an adjective like brutal and callous, something that implies clear malice or some sort of evil human intent behind it. So when something of that nature happens, we can see that this is not treated as if, wow, this was just a bad thing that happened, that no, this is treated as if it is a specific act of injustice expressed in a violent way in the killing of George Floyd. And so I would just going to pay more attention to this because I think it's something that I just notice more and more. The way that violence, especially, is treated as this sort of naked term without any sort of adjectives or qualifiers on it, seems to get portrayed almost as if it's just something that happened. It's an unfortunate, lamentable event that happens, but it's not something that results from human agency, and therefore is not an expression of injustice. So those are two things I just want you to pay attention to. And again, send me examples or counterexamples that show whether you think this is a trend that you've noticed. Uses of the word violence, is it increasing or decreasing? Violence portrayed as a separate category from injustice, and violence presented in a way that could make us think it is essentially a natural phenomenon. And also, I would say in the justice part of it, when you're thinking about justice, when pastors talk about justice, are they talking about justice, due from God to the sinner, that kind of penal justice? Are they talking about criminal justice? It's just remarkable to me how little criminal justice seems to factor into the discussions of justice in our society. In fact, I would gather that most of the time we hear about criminal justice, it's in how the criminal justice system is unjust towards people like George Floyd. Not so much about how people who are victims of violent crime deserve to have justice. So, again, I am not drawing a deep conclusion at this time. Again, I always point out the genre of the podcast is talk radio. This is a place where I can sort of explore ideas that are not fully formed, that I can, be a little more free, if you will, in a way that I can't be in a magazine article, for example, or I don't want to be in my newsletter. And so this is one, I just want to point it out, let's call it an early stage observation. Here is a pattern of language that I see people using, and I'm just going to pay attention and see what happens. And over time, maybe it will turn into something. Maybe I'll write about it, or maybe I'll say, Aaron, you're wrong. That was just a couple little things you noticed. They're anomalies. Here's all this other stuff. So this is how I develop a lot of my content. I make an observation, I see something, and I say, wow, that's interesting. Let's pay more attention to that. And then I collect little data points. Sometimes I see a trend. Sometimes I see connections to other trends. Sometimes I see overlaps in certain language being used in certain social networks. And then all of a sudden, you can start creating a heuristic framework of the world. You start creating a lens that gives you some insights to understand what's going on. So anyhow, another not too long podcast today. I just wanted to throw that little one out there, and I hope to get some good emails from some of you. I'll talk to you next week.